Snoopy greetings. It is the 28th of December 2020, and I'm the so-called Gnostic'Arrogator, here to deliver a unique report, and it's a peculiar one. Let me lay it on the table here and tell you what happened to Kurt Lischka. First, I want to make the disclaimer that I'm not related to this man, nor anyone else in the report I'm about to deliver, although I was inspired to use his name after what I've learned from him, and it is similar to my own, and I am also of German descent. As a fair warning, there are a few terms, a few German words that I may fluctuate in my pronunciation, so please bear with me there. And also, another fair warning is that most of the files that I've compiled here for you, I've pulled directly from Wikipedia, which I know is a dubious source, and you may know as well of their particularly strong alliance with Hasbara. But in any case, I'm going to go over two primary profiles for you. Let's start with Mr. Lischka. Here he is. This is when he was in custody. He went to court in 1980. And let's discover out for what. This is his Wikipedia profile. It's pretty sparse. There's only 5 paragraphs. I'm going to go over this little summarized footnote. It's a little summary of each of the paragraphs here. The first one is his introduction, and it tells us of his affiliation with the German military. And the second one gives a brief bio. He had studied law in Breslau and Berlin, worked for a while in the court in Breslau. In 1933, he joined the SS, eventually reaching the level of SS Lieutenant Colonel in 1942, and also joined the Gestapo in 1935, of which he became the head in 1940. So there's a fair background for you of his particular activities during the time of the World War II. And the third paragraph here gives 2 separate accusations. Well, you tell me if this is oddly worded here. Lischka headed the operation, which resulted in the incarceration of over 30,000 German Jews, immediately following the mass destruction of Jewish property in the Kristallnacht pogrom of the 9th and 10th of November 1938 period. As a SIPO SD chief of Paris, Lischka was responsible for the largest single mass deportation of Jews in occupied France. All right, so you've got 2 accusations there, and it's the same victim in each case. Different places, though, and times. Incarceration and deportation. This is the primary description of his crimes. Well, the fourth one talks about his status as a prisoner of war. See, he was captured afterwards and imprisoned in France in 1945. But then the French extradited him to Czechoslovakia in 1947 for his war crimes there. Eventually he was released in 1950, went back to West Germany, and it mentions here, though a Paris court sentenced him in absentia to life imprisonment, Lischka lived out more than 25 years in freedom, working under his own name in the Federal Republic of Germany, as, among other positions, a judge. Ooh. There's a crime for you there, Mr. Lischka. Well, you seem to have been stepping on someone's judicial territory. I can tell you there were apparently a couple folks that were not satisfied with that. So the final paragraph gives a brief description of what I call the Klarsfeld incident. Here it says, as a result of the activities of Holocaust survivor Sergei Klarsfeld and his wife Betty Klarsfeld, Lischka was eventually arrested in Cologne. Lischka was sentenced to a 10-year prison term on the 2nd of February 1980, and following his early release on health grounds, died in a nursing home on the 16th of May 1989 in Brühl. Well, that concludes what you have here for the Wikipedia or the Hasbara article. I have looked a little around and I didn't find any non-Hasbara sources. So you can consider that a challenge to yourself. Perhaps you can find more details on that. But knowing that Wikipedia itself is dubious, I do see here there are references, but not for every single claim. I went and pulled another article from the Holocaust Historical Society, which I'm only guessing is as close to Hasbara as Wikipedia. If not, they are definitely working for the same tribe. But this article gives a bit more detail. I'm going to go over it again in the same manner briefly here. The first 3 paragraphs give us the same introduction. Basically, these 2 articles are telling us the same narrative. As you know, the word Hasbara means narrative or explanation, I believe. And we see again the first paragraph talks about how he was in the SS. The second paragraph talks about how he was in the Gestapo. And the third paragraph, get this, tells us what Lischka's forte was. The Jewish question, in which he had specialized since 1938, pardon me. He was head of the Reich Center for Jewish Immigration in Berlin and played a key role in the deportation and murder of 80,000 Jews in France. Now here's a bit of the problematical grammar here. That's a run-on sentence. This one paragraph is a run-on sentence describing 4 or 5 different events. In any case, Lischka's forte was the JQ. I wouldn't say that is mine as well. My forte, I wouldn't claim it to be my forte anyway. I can say a bit about the JQ. In fact, I'm, as part of this report, preparing myself to do so. Although I would speak more about the JP, as it is plainly obvious today in many respects. In any case, moving on quickly here. The 4th paragraph, which is loaded, talks about his status post-World War II. Again, December 10th, 1945, he was arrested in Schleswig-Holstein and then interned by actually the British first, we learn here. And the British handed him over to the French, which, as the Wikipedia article says, the French held him until May 2nd, 1947. And then he was extradited to Czechoslovakia. So you can see I bullet point 3 different areas of foreign internment. A period or a situation that he endured until the 22nd of August, 1950, when they released him. And he returned to West Germany. The 5th article repeats what we saw on the Wikipedia page, but gives us a date, September 18th, 1950, in Paris. A French court there, of course, sentenced him in absentia absentia. There's that funny little word again. In absentia. And his sentence was hard labor for life. The 6th paragraph gives us some new information that we don't find in the Wikipedia article. It says that Sergei Klarsfeld, a French Jewish lawyer and himself a Holocaust survivor, and his German wife, Betty, attempted to kidnap Lischka in 1974. It doesn't give a specific date. They attempted to kidnap him in order to take him to France to face justice at a retrial. The kidnapping attempt was foiled, but it gained widespread publicity for the case. The publicity caused the West German authorities to act, and a trial was held in Cologne of Lischka and 2 other Germans who were brought charges against in July of 1978. So it wasn't Lischka alone who they eventually got. They rounded up 3 of these ex-Nazis. Kurt Lischka himself, and also a man named Herbert Martin Hagen and Ernst Henriksson. The 7th paragraph here gives a dossier, the dossier of the prosecution, what all their war crimes were. Henriksson served as an adjunct to Lischka in Paris, and Hagen had been a top SD official in occupied France. But get this, it adds as part of this little dossier that Henriksson had become a mayor of Brunstadt in Bavaria, and Hagen had built a successful career as an industrialist in West Germany. It seems to list these details as part of the crime. Enjoying prosperity as an ex-Nazi. I guess that's illegal. All right. Well, they were all eventually sentenced on the 2nd of February in 1980. Kurt himself, then aged 70, was sentenced to 10 years, but was only able to complete 9. The final paragraph gives a death account for all of these ex-Nazis, Kurt's being the earliest, May 16th, 1989, in Brühl. Well, I hope I've given an adequate profile for this character anyway, as little as we know about him, really. But let's take a look at the profile of the champions who brought this man to justice. And here they are. The Klarsfelds. This is Sergei and his wife, Betty Klarsfeld, a photograph that I pulled from Wikipedia of their trip to Jerusalem, of all places. This is Serge Klarsfeld's Wikipedia page, which was quite lengthy. I just chopped it a couple of sections here. So you can accuse me right off the bat of selectively bringing details to your attention. You damn right I'm selectively bringing details to your attention here. If you really want to look up this man's profile, he's got ample details on Wikipedia and other pages. Just go look up his own foundation here, klarsfeldfoundation.org, if you want to know anything about this man. All right, well, let's read it here. Romanian-born French activist and Nazi hunter, known for documenting the Holocaust in order to establish the record and to enable the prosecution of war criminals. Since the 1960s, he has made notable efforts to commemorate the Jewish victims of German-occupied France and has been a supporter of Israel. Well, that's a great profile there already. Let's look at what I got here, what I've pulled. And the very first, I selected this from the section titled Activism. He had done a lot of things with activism. This is not even the full section. But the very first segment of this section is quite interesting. In 2012, the archivist of the Stasi revealed that Betty Klarsfeld's attack on the German Chancellor, Kurt George Kiesinger, by publicly slapping him on the 7th of November, 1968, was carried out in agreement and with the support of the government of East Germany, which was conducting a campaign against West German politicians. See Braunbuck. Betty Klarsfeld was paid 2,000 Deutschmarks by the Stasi for her actions. Both Serge and Betty Klarsfeld were revealed to have been regular Stasi contacts. Yes, interesting. And they also cooperated with the Stasi in the 1960s in blackmailing West German politicians for Second World War activities. Well, I don't know about you, but I find it interesting that the Hasbara writers of this article would come out swinging and present such accomplishments as something of a positive character. They seem to think these are positive traits. Look at that, Stasi contact. We hear a little bit about a 1968 attack on Kiesinger. Well, we get into that further along here. And blackmail. Well, tell me, are those actions of merit? Let's look some further. In 1974, Sergei and Betty Klarsfeld were both convicted in West Germany on felony charges of attempted kidnapping of Kurt Lischka in order to transport him to France for prosecution. After conviction of felony charges, they were each sentenced to 2 months in prison. Following international protest, the sentence was suspended. Activism by the Klarsfelds and by descendants of Lischka's victims eventually resulted in changes to the laws. In 1980, Lischka was convicted of a felony in West Germany and sentenced to prison, as I've already detailed. All right, so now we hear a little bit more details about that wacky kidnapping attempt, or it's more of a stunt that they pulled. And note here the publicity that it gained, eventually pressuring the German authorities to deliver justice. Here is a small section here, attack on the Klarsfelds, which I call it retaliation, and they are very brief on this. Here they say they were a victim of a car bombing, or they were the targets of a car bombing, although no one was injured, and supposedly individuals from Nazi Odessa claimed responsibility for the attack, but there are absolutely no sources cited. There's no citations for this, so I didn't get the chance easily to look it up, and aside from that, there is no strong detail. They don't go into too much detail, but what I do want to know more of is this first sentence. The Klarsfelds' activities and methods generated controversy. Period. No citation. The Klarsfelds' activities and methods generated controversy. Well, you tell me. Are they not unfamiliar with controversial methods and activities? What with being in contact with the Stasi, blackmail, kidnapping. Not controversial at all, right? And this final section details more of their Nazi hunting campaign and lists a few of the victims here. Klaus Barbie, Maurice Papon. Seems that they went on this crusade until the late 90s, 1998, when they finally got Maurice Papon. Here again, in 1970s, the Klarsfeld considered kidnapping Barbie in much the same way as the Mossad did Eichmann, but the plan fell through. So, I wasn't aware of this detail or of this separate event, but of course it is worth looking into. From a glance, it looks like something to look into. Mossad kidnapping Eichmann. You can see that this fellow and his wife were something of Mossad wannabes. Well, they definitely were Stasi wannabes, if not full-on Stasi. There again, I conclude with another, pulled right from the Wikipedia page, proudly stated, no shame. Well, let's go take a look at his counterpart. And here she is, or here's a section again of her Wikipedia page. Miss B.T. Klarsfeld, Beate. I'm not sure how you pronounce that, so I'm going to pronounce it in a number of ways. Beat August Klarsfeld, née Kunzel, is a Franco-German journalist who, along with her French husband Sergei, became famous for their investigation and documentation of numerous Nazi war criminals, including Kurt Lischka, Alois Brunner, Klaus Barbie, Ernst Ehlers, Kurt Asche, and more. In March 2012, she ran as the candidate for the left in the 2012 German presidential election against Joachim Gauck, but lost by 126 to 991. Well, that's interesting. Was she going for something of an Angela Merkel there? Alright, I've only copied one section, and it is a big, huge section titled Action Against Kaisinger. So, the first 5 paragraphs are pretty much a prelude to this action, in quotes. The first one here talks about how the beef was kicked off with, what's his name again? Kurt George Kaisinger, chosen as the German Chancellor in 1966, November 1966. And Miss Betty, who was a writer for the French newspaper Combat, began writing articles the following year, publicly coming out against him. And in July, she wrote an article in which he insinuates that he made his good reputation for himself in the ranks of the brown shirts. And I guess that article got her fired, although she and her husband did retaliate legally, saying that it was unjust, of course. And they also redoubled their journalistic campaign against Kaisinger. Well, the second and third paragraphs say just that, and they talk about how Betty outed Kaisinger as a Nazi and as being responsible for Nazi radio broadcasting and promoting anti-Semitism. The fourth paragraph talks about an instant where she was in Bonn Bundestag in April 1986 and shouted, "Nazi Kaisinger, resign," from the audience. And goes between East and West Germany. Again, remember, she was cooperating with the Stasi and the East Germans in blackmailing and also smearing the West German politicians. The fifth paragraph here says that she spoke in front of a student body of about 2,000 to 3,000 students in the Technical University of Berlin on May 9th. And she gives a promise to slap Kaisinger in public. Well, on November 7th of the same year, she delivers on that slapstick. And of course, she was arrested. I'm not sure if she was not arrested, but she received a 1-year custodial sentence in an accelerated hearing. She says in an interview with, which one was it? Der Spiegel, that she had planned the attack as early as May 9th, so that's how we'd know of what she promised to do and how she delivered on that promise. And even goes into detail of why they selected Berlin, because it was, get this, a 4-power status city, or the city had a 4-power status, and they knew that her French citizenship, which she got from her marriage, that she would only be punished mildly for being in Berlin. And that's pretty interesting. So does that mean that if you're from France or if you're from Spain, you could go to Berlin and, say, for example, slap Angela Merkel and get away with it? Something interesting to think of. In any case, 8 tells us how she evaded justice thanks to the help of her lawyer Horst Mahler, as well as some violence she inspired in some of the students who were pelting rocks or pelted stones at the judge's windows, calling his judgment a terror judgment. And eventually her sentence was shortened from 1 year to 4 months, but suspended on probation, so she got off anyway. And says here that Klarsfeld justified the act in a poem that she recorded on November 23rd, 1968. Accordingly, Klarsfeld explained that her slap was on behalf of 50 million dead of World War II, as well as future generations. She wanted it to be understood as a slap in the, quote, face, the repulsive face of 10 million Nazis, unquote. And the final paragraph details of how she lost an election when she tried to run against him, apparently, in 1969, but lost. Kaisinger received 60,000 votes, and Klarsfeld only received 644. Well, isn't that the profile of a dynamic duo? Also have here a copy of her very poem that she wrote and broadcasted, I presume. Die Orphig de Deutschland brauchte. And she repeats this line over and over again. Es brauchte sie, which means something of, it took her, as I saw in the translation. Es brauchte sie, es brauchte sie, es brauchte sie. I don't speak German, and I wouldn't learn it just to read this poem, but I've included it here in the file. Well, we've got quite a profile here, and I want to go again over Lischka here, Mr. Kurt Lischka, evil German Nazi. The question is really here, apparently Germany was not punished enough. Well, let's analyze that. Let's analyze it in the case of this fellow. Briefly analyzing it. We don't know a whole lot about his particular involvement in so-called war crimes, but we can see what he went through here. Well, he was arrested in December 1945. First interned by the British, and then the French, until 1947, and then extradited to Czechoslovakia from 1947 until 1950. Well, that's about 2 years in France and about 3 years in Czechoslovakia. And it took them almost 25 years to get him in 1980, where he got another 10 years, but only served 9. Now, the only issue I want to raise here are the circumstances. You see, he wasn't necessarily a Nazi on the run, as far as I can see with the profile that they've given us, that Hasbar has given us. There is no, he wasn't in hiding. He did not have to escape from the French. He was held there for 2 years, and in that time, apparently, they couldn't get him on anything. They couldn't do anything with him. Otherwise, why didn't they do that in the time between 45 and 47? They instead thought that, in Czechoslovakia, he's probably got something more severe. And indeed, it did say that he was a member of something, the Referat for the Bohemian Protectorate in the Reich Main Security Office in Czechoslovakia. But neither did they find anything worth keeping him a prisoner for, so they released him. Or that's what you can infer from being released, right? And it wasn't until after they released him that the French decided to convict him anyway, in absentia. Now, those are some vocabulary words that I want you to consider as well. The first one, so here are 3 vocab words that I want you to consider, and I'll have to make another video to go over them perhaps. First, we got extradite, jurisdiction, and in absentia. And you tell me how each of these words relate to one another. Well, I'll give you my suggestion anyway. Well, I believe that extradite means that not only do you surrender a prisoner to another authority for them to judge and for them to process, not only do you surrender the prisoner, but also you surrender the jurisdiction. At the point when he was no longer a prisoner in France in 1947, when they sent him to Czechoslovakia, right there and then France disowned all jurisdiction. They had him at one point, but by the fact of extraditing, they give up jurisdiction. So then tell me how you think it's sensible or fair that they can go ahead and pass jurisdiction, pass judgment anyway, in absentia. This is a very critical term that I want to bring to your attention out of all of this. If anything, consider that term, in absentia. And note clearly here, he was present in France for 2 years, almost 2 years, okay, a year and a half, but they gave up on him. He was present there, and they couldn't convict him in his presence. They could only do it in his absence. And I'm going to suggest to you that this is how justice works. This is how what ought to be called the injustice system, what they call the corrupt justice system. It's the justice system. It works this way. It works in your absence. They pass laws in your absence. They pass judgment in your absence. And how easy is it for somebody to make any kind of claim against you if you're not present there to defend yourself? Well, closing this up, or before I do have to go over, I feel obligated to go over briefly the Kristallnacht event that was noted in his Wikipedia page, although I will remind you that no source comes out and claims that he had any involvement with Kristallnacht as such, although we can infer that he had some involvement in the following event, which is the mass arrests following Kristallnacht. And I will admit that I don't know a whole lot about this event myself. Aside that, it is part of the war atrocity propaganda against the Germans. Now, first here, it says that it was a pogrom against the Jews carried out by SA parliamentary forces and civilians throughout Nazi Germany on the 9th and 10th of November 1938. So in the terms of the question, who, you see SA parliamentary forces, which is their military forces, and civilians. So this is not something that was single-handedly carried out by the German military alone. Whatever it was, whatever the actual circumstance of the actual event was, which, at least according to this article, was kicked off by the assassination of a German diplomat, Ernst von Rath, by Herschel Greisenpan, something like that. A 17-year-old German-born Polish Jew living in Paris. Well, what a conundrum. What a strange clash of ethnicities all around. I just want to go here. Estimates of the fatalities caused by the attacks have varied. Early reports estimate that 91 Jews had been murdered. Modern analysis of German scholarly sources put the figure much higher, when deaths from post-arrest maltreatment and subsequent suicides are included. The death toll reaches the hundreds, with Richard J. Evans estimating 638 deaths by suicide. Okay. All right, so you've got civilian involvement, but then you also have here a low death count, 91. Well, how can we boost these numbers? Well, Mr. Evans, historian here, wants to blame the suicides. Tell me what your sensibility says about that. I can see blaming the Germans or blaming anyone for trauma, for inflicting trauma on someone. But I don't know how anyone gets off by assigning blame for someone's suicide. If that's not a level of absurdity, I don't know what is. So I just pulled that little snippet from Wikipedia, and actually these are two separate articles, and that tells me that you can consider them as two separate events, which sensibly fits. So you have the mass arrest after Kristallnacht. Approximately 30,000 Jews in Germany and Austria were deported within the region or the country after the Kristallnacht. They were deported to concentration camps Buchenwald, Dachau, and Sachsenhausen. Totally butchered that one. All right, so we're starting out here, following November 10th, approximately 30,000 Jews. Now, these are some interesting details, and you can look over it. I'm I'm just going to cut down here to the section that says parole. And it says the duration of imprisonment was very different. From the end of November 1938, 150 to 250 Aktionsjuden were released daily. On the 1st of January 1939, 1,605 Jews were still imprisoned in Buchenwald and 958 in Sachsenhausen. All right, so we have a number by the 1st of January, and that comes up to be roughly 2,600 still imprisoned. Now, this event began on November 11th, so it's about 10 days short of a full 2 months. But in the course of 2 months, you go from 30,000 down to 2,600 prisoners. And even the article itself admits that most of them were released and they were processed. So I take that, and you can take this as my deliberate downplay of the shock wave of this event, of the consequences of this event. But don't take my research for it. This is something that's worth your research as well, if it sparks your interest. To close out, I'm just going to go over a few of these photos that I've pulled. Here's Kurt. There's not a whole lot of photographs of him, and you can do an image search yourself and find the originals, much higher quality. You'll have to forgive my printing capacities here. They're all of different shapes and sizes. Here's Kurt in captivity, perhaps awaiting his trial on February 2nd, 1980. Remember, he's 70 years old at this time. Now here, which I didn't get from any of the articles, but these are photographs of protests against Lischka, headed by Betty Klarsfeld and Sarge themselves. You see, she's holding a poster here. It's similar to the one that these fellows are posting. You can see it. Gestapo Chief Lischka verantwortlich für den Abtransport von 80,000 Juden in Vernichtungslager 1941 to 1942. 80,000. All right, what a claim. And she makes pretty much the same. He was an Obsturmbannführer. That is the colonel status he had in the SS. And here's more from the protests. They probably were rallying outside of the courthouse on the day of his trial, or on the days leading up to his trial, as you see these days. You know, it's quite a gig they've got going on. Now, this one, on the other hand, is not of Kurt Lischka's trial. In fact, it's of Betty Klarsfeld's trial in Cologne in 1974. When she was she and her husband were arrested and sentenced for their kidnapping attempt of Lischka. So you can see here they're in the courthouse, all dressed up in their pajamas and wearing their medals and stars and upside down triangles, saying, "Let her go, or whatever. I don't know what they actually said, but you can imagine those scenarios. Another photograph of Sergei and his trophy wife Betty. You see, he opened her eyes to the evil ways of her German parents, and they worked together to bring action and publicity. Really, my suspicion is that they were after publicity. They wanted to be known as Nazi hunters, and if you're going to be known as a hunter, you have to have some trophies. It's not so much that this guy personally did anything to them. He just was an easy target. That may have been the case. You tell me. And this is an interesting, or what I think it's a very interesting illustration of a book. For the book, For Justice, the Sergei and Betty Klarsfeld story. Well, just look at the expression that they give Betty. Look at the scowl on that face and that nose. Very interesting. And here's from the same illustrator. Again with that peculiar scowl. She doesn't even look like that. And look at her son. Here they are again. Well, thank you again, folks. Remember your vocabulary words. I don't know what else to say, except for that I may call this something else. Aside from what happened to Kurt Lischka, let's give that a different title. How about Stasi hunting? Stasi hunting Gestapos. Thanks again, and just of course, if you find anything that I've misrepresented here, please leave a comment. Please send me a message. Again, you can send me an email at Gnostic'Arrogator@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you, and you can let me know if I'm full of crap.